On December 20th, the Ethiopian rebel group, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or the TPLF, announced that it would withdraw its troops back into the Tigray province. This is a key turning point in the war which began in November 2020 when the TPLF attacked a Federation military base in Tigray. Over the course of the year, the conflict has caused a massive humanitarian disaster, which was compounded by allegations of the TPLF seizing aid trucks. There have also been a lot of allegations of human rights violations. The TPLF now claims that its bold act of withdrawal will be a decisive opening for peace. What have been the trajectory of events that have led to this development? How has the fighting developed in recent times? Elias, Amare, editor of HornOfAfrica-TV, answers these questions.
Let's begin with events the end of June 29 to be precise, when the government of Ethiopia declared a unilateral humanitarian ceasefire and withdrew from Tigray for several purposes, primarily to give the peasants during the rainy season a chance to plow their farmland, and secondly, to give peace a chance, basically a moment of reflection on all sides, especially the people of Tigray to reflect. But what happened was that immediately upon the withdrawal, the TPLF, emboldened by this, decided to launch massive offensives in all directions, west, south, east, towards the Amhara, the Afar region, and then westwards towards the Sudanese border. So that's what's been happening during the past, say, from beginning of July up to recent times, over 5 months. And the TPLF initially made advances in some fronts, particularly the Amhara front to the south and the Afar area. But it met fierce resistance, of course. During this time, there was no considerations of peace at all. It was all belligerent talk on the part of the TPLF. And of course, the international community, so-called the Western countries, the US and the European countries, didn't say anything during this time about negotiations. So it kept advancing. And as it advanced, massive atrocities, human rights abuses, massacres, to which the international community again gave deaf ear. During this time, also, they were bragging that within 2-3 weeks, they would reach to Addis Ababa. So, and they were saying, their top leaders were saying on record that there is nobody to negotiate with. Essentially, the central government is crumbling. That's what they were claiming. So bellicose, belligerent tone of voice was the only thing that we heard. But beginning of early November, the government forces regrouped, massive mobilization, total mobilization. The prime minister himself decided to go to the war front as commander-in-chief, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali, that is. And so the fortunes were reversed quickly. And you saw within weeks that TPLF forces way overstretched beyond their home base of Tigray. I mean, hundreds of kilometers far away. Their logistics lines were overextended. Their troops were also decimated, overstretched on all fronts. And within a few weeks, they were routed and fleeing helter-skelter towards their home base. But in this period of time, the past couple of weeks especially, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, in alliance with the regional militias of the Afar and Amhara regions, encircled these forces of aggression from Tigray, invasionary forces, and I must say it was a total decimation. And so for the TPLF now to declare that they were withdrawing to give peace a chance is laughable and hypocritical indeed. It is not that they are giving peace a chance by withdrawing. They were forced, they were routed to flee. And thus, at this time, the tone has changed, and they are appealing to the United Nations, to the Western patriots, to save them, to declare, no-fly zone and what have you. That's the situation we are in right now.
In light of this offer, what is the position the Ethiopian government is likely to take? What are the ways ahead for peace, and what might be the requirements?
Well, the Ethiopian government is saying that they have been for peace all along, that this war was not of their doing. It was imposed on them. It was a treasonous insurrection act of the TPLF that ignited the war. TPLF, mind you, that at times was openly declaring for secession. And so under these circumstances, having given peace, all the chance, having tried all avenues, the central government has no option but to see to it that this subversive force be completely disarmed and is no longer poses a threat to national sovereignty and stability, and that all the actors that were responsible for the massive atrocities, violations of human rights and war destructions have to be brought to justice. This is the position of the government of Ethiopia. At the same time, they have initiated a national dialogue. A commission has been appointed by the parliament, the Commission for National Dialogue. So all issues pertaining to, the political situation in the country, all controversial or contentious issues will be discussed. All actors will be invited to the table. And through this national dialogue, a national reconciliation and a path forward will be charted. So this is the only option that the government sees as a way out, as a peaceful way out. But the TPLF, warmongers that have been responsible for these massive destructions have to be brought to justice, is what the government is saying. And I think within the next few weeks, this adventurous warmongering of the TPLF will be brought to an end, and the culprits, the criminals, war criminals, brought to face justice.
The Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, first came to power in Ethiopia in 1991. It remained in power for almost 30 years until 2018. During this period, TPLF committed various atrocities and human rights violations across the country. Throughout its regime, and even now during the current civil war in Ethiopia, the TPLF has enjoyed support from the United States and the European Union. Why have the Western powers supported TPLF all this time? What has been the history of TPLF's rise and fall from power in the country? Elias, Amare, editor of HornOfAfrica-TV, explains.
For nearly 3 decades, the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, once it seized power in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, in 1991, it became a client state of the West, a very loyal client state to fulfill the orders of Washington, basically, a regional proxy force that the West could send to Somalia to invade, to Eritrea to launch an aggressive border war, to crush all opposition within Ethiopia. And so that's the task that it has been fulfilling. You have to remember the United States has this, military project in Africa called AFRICOM, the Africa Command. And they have a base in Djibouti, and Ethiopia during the time of TPLF in power was a trusted ally of the West. It invaded Somalia in 2006, ostensibly to extend the war on terror against Al-Shabaab terrorists, but it was to put Somalia in check. Somalia was beginning to reconstitute at that time under the Union of Islamic Courts. Some semblance of stability and reconstruction of the state that has been in shambles was beginning to return. And the TPLF invaded. This time, Eritrea was the only country in the region to oppose this invasion of TPLF of Somalia in 2006. And for that, essentially, Eritrea was punished by having sanctions imposed on it, US engineered sanctions at the United Nations Security Council. So once the TPLF, was overthrown from power, you can say in 2018, due to massive popular uprising that have had it with this tyrannical minority rule of the TPLF. We must not forget that the TPLF was a minority of a minority. It hailed from a region that only constituted 5% of the Ethiopian population, and it did not represent the Tigrayan population as such. It was a narrow clique, a narrow kleptocratic clique that ruled in the name of Tigray. Tigray itself is a minority in Ethiopia, 5% of the population. So the only way TPLF could rule Ethiopia was through ethnic politics, ethnic federalism it called it, but pitting one ethnic group against the other, vertical polarization, sectarianism, divide and rule between, instigating ethnic clashes, inter-ethnic clashes, inter-religious clashes. In that way, this tiny minority clique was able to rule for 27 years with impunity in Ethiopia. All throughout these 27 years, it was fully backed and supported by the United States and the European Union, financially, politically, militarily, and diplomatically. During these 27 years also, we must not forget it committed horrendous atrocities inside Ethiopia. Massacres in the Ogaden Somali region, genocide in the western region of Gambela, in Oromia, in Amare, all over Ethiopia, there were human rights violations, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It also invaded Eritrea in 1998 and 2000, ostensibly under border clashes, but eventually this was supposed to have been resolved, the issue when Algiers peace agreement between the two countries decided that the border issue would be settled by arbitration court at The Hague. Now, when the arbitration court rendered its verdict in 2002, as prior agreement, it was to be final and binding. Eritrea accepted the ruling of the arbitration court. Ethiopia, TPLF regime rejected this. So for these reasons, sanctions were imposed on Eritrea to punish it. And as I mentioned earlier, eventually resentment and unrest spread all over Ethiopia, initially in the Oromia region, called the Oromo protests, but spread rapidly throughout Ethiopia from 2015 to 2018, 3 years of continuous unrest until eventually this brought down the era of minority rule of the TPLF. And from within its EPRDF umbrella organization, Abiy Ahmed was elected as reform prime minister. And what he did in 2018, upon coming to power, the first thing he did was to resolve the conflict with Eritrea through peaceful means. He accepted the decision of the boundary ruling and the peace agreement and made a trip to Eritrea several months after he came to power. And so once this was resolved, this was not to the liking of the Western patrons of TPLF. A new era began to emerge of peace between Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia, an era of stability, peace, and cooperation. And as I said, this was not to the liking of the patrons of the TPLF regime, which by this time had fled to its home base in Tigray, the northernmost province. And from 2018 up to 2020, for 2 years, it continued to reject the peace overtures by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali. Many peace delegations were sent to reconcile the TPLF and bring it back to the fold, but the TPLF remained belligerent. It spread chaos and ethnic conflicts all over Ethiopia because, remember, it controlled the security apparatus for 28 years. So it had cell networks throughout Ethiopia. It had tremendous wealth at its disposal that it had looted during its kleptocratic regime. Some say upwards of $50 billion were stolen from Ethiopia by the TPLF. And so with this, vast wealth at its disposal, it was able to buy mercenary proxy forces within Ethiopia and try to disrupt and destabilize Ethiopia, to make Ethiopia ungovernable for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali. The final, I think, straw that broke the camel's back came when elections were postponed, national elections due to COVID pandemic, but TPLF would not accept the National Election Board's decision to postpone the elections for some time until it was safe to conduct national elections. So it went ahead and carried out its own elections in the region and called the central government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali illegitimate, and it began to mobilize, to ratchet up, to beat the war drums, and in 2 years' time, by the way, it trained upwards of 250,000 of special forces, militias, and irregular armed, units. So by the beginning of November 2020, it undertook a massive preemptive attack on the Northern Command in the Tigray region, the Northern Command of the Federal Army bases. It attacked during the night and killed several thousands. Some estimate up to 6,000 Ethiopian soldiers were killed. The remaining fled to Eritrea. About 10,000 ethnic Tigrayans switched sides, of course. It captured the strategic heavy weaponry, rocket missiles, and what have you. And so this was an act of treason that no country could tolerate. No country on earth would tolerate such kind of treasonous insurrection from within. So the Prime Minister Abiy and the Parliament declared the TPLF a terrorist organization and undertook, counter-attack, which had repulsed the TPLF, cleared it from the capital, and they went and hid in the bushes, in the wilderness. But after several months of, conflict and war in the region, the federal government, as I mentioned earlier, decided to declare a unilateral humanitarian ceasefire and withdraw from Tigray, to give peace a chance, that was. But during this period, must be remembered, the United States and the European Union allies continuously were supportive of the TPLF. They were putting all kinds of pressure on the federal government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali. And it is this situation that eventually led to the declaration of unilateral ceasefire by the Ethiopian government. But once having declared ceasefire and withdrawn, as I have mentioned earlier, the TPLF, emboldened and prodded by its patrons, Western patrons, decided to expand the military operations and go all the way to Addis Ababa to overthrow the government. So this is the stance of Western governments that have been igniting the conflict, emboldening the TPLF under the guise of humanitarian intervention and food aid. They have been feeding the war machine of the TPLF essentially. And now that the TPLF is again being routed, the call for negotiation we hear from the West that has been completely silent. And at the same time, the psychological warfare, the war by media, by Western corporate media has been intensified to an unprecedented degree. Disinformation during the past months was unbelievable, incredible. I mean, they were manufacturing defeat, manufacturing false information that the TPLF was literally on the gates of Addis Ababa, just at the outskirts, and pressuring foreign embassies to flee the capital of Addis Ababa. Some African countries did, withdraw from the capital, but many remained. And this is the situation where we are right now. The TPLF has been completely exhausted. It's all its, troop strength, its arsenal. It is fleeing. It's on the retreat, on the verge of defeat. And at this time, we hear once again the call for negotiations.
Since the last time you talked to us, where you described the latest situation in Ethiopia, why the TPLF was forced to withdraw, there have been some major developments on the ground. I believe the Ethiopian government has taken a new position. So could you maybe tell us a bit more about what's happening right now?
Thank you, Prasant. Yes, today, or I should say yesterday, the Ethiopian government communication minister, Dr. Legesse Tulu, came and issued a statement, a position statement of the government, in which he said that the government forces are ordered to stay put now where they are. They have essentially pushed out the invasionary force of the Tigrayans back to their home base, and so they will be standing until further orders at the borders. That is one thing, and the other thing he indicated the reason for that was that the government doesn't want to be trapped in a sort of quagmire that it found itself earlier this year. You remember, after it defeated the TPLF forces by end of November 2020, for almost 6 months, it tried to administer Tigray, to provide relief aid for the population, and to start reconstruction. But due to various reasons, one of it partly is the failure of the provisional government of Tigray, infiltration of fifth column elements, assassination of civil servants, administrators that were appointed, and the TPLF reverting to guerrilla-type insurgencies, trying to make life miserable for the Ethiopian army. For that reason, the government had withdrawn on 29 June, declared a unilateral humanitarian ceasefire and withdrawn from Tigray. So essentially, where we find ourselves now is in that back to square one, sort of, to speak, back to June 29 situation. So the government does not want to go into Tigray because its intelligence indicates that the TPLF wants to create mass graves. It had transported dead soldiers from its dead troops from the Amare region, the Afar region, and had buried them in mass graves. And thus it was preparing to to present a manufactured genocide. And this, I think, is a legitimate fear for the government because we witnessed earlier, about a week ago, the UN Human Rights Commission wanting to reopen another investigation. It had already done an investigation with the cooperation of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and declared its findings that there was no genocide in Tigray committed, that food aid was not used as a weapon by the government. But now, because due to pressure from Western governments, in particular those who push the humanitarian intervention R2P doctrine, so to speak, which is not supported by international law, by the way. The Samantha powers of Washington, essentially, to call a spade a spade. These forces had been pushing for a reopening of human rights investigations. And so the government's intelligence also indicates that the TPLF was preparing such kind of manufactured scenario. And so it had ordered its troops not to enter Tigray. That means any mass graves that are found, the government would not be responsible because it has been away from Tigray for the past 6 months. So I think this is a wise move. And the other major reason is also to once again give the people of Tigray time to reflect. What do they want? The government has declared cessation of hostilities. Where do they go from here? We have heard from some government officials previously, perhaps in frustration, that have said, well, if the people of Tigray want to secede, that's their right. We have rules and procedures, mechanisms within the constitution of the federal government of Ethiopia, whereby if people want to secede, there are procedures to be followed, and then they can go for a self-determination referendum. And, if that's the will of the people, let them go, is what some frustrated officials of the Ethiopian government have been saying. So essentially, this is a time of reflection. What do the people of Tigray want? Where do they want to go? If they are held hostage against their will by the TPLF, now is the time to hold these war criminals accountable and, put their fate and destiny with the rest of Ethiopia. So that's essentially where we find ourselves now.
The recent development over the past week has been what looks like definitely some breakthroughs as far as the war is concerned, because we do have the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the rebel group which launched the civil war in November 2020, finally deciding to withdraw back to its own province. And now this is a key moment because it's important to remember the chronology of the civil war, first of all, where in November 2020, the TPLF started it. The government announced a ceasefire after one round of battle, after the TPLF had been defeated. The government announced a unilateral ceasefire in June and withdrew. And once again, the TPLF resumed the offensive in July, entered the neighboring provinces of Amare and Afar, caused a huge amount of displacement, damage, thousands of deaths, a lot of human rights abuses and atrocities as well, many of which are still yet to be properly chronicled on the ground. So all this while, of course, the United States and its allies have been, covertly and overtly supporting the TPLF. We recently, some weeks ago, spoke to a very senior expert, a diplomat who firmly believed, for instance, that the Biden administration was very strongly backing the TPLF. And now we're in a situation where after months of war, including when Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed went to the front lines to lead the troops, the TPLF has actually been pretty much forced to withdraw back to its own province. The latest news, of course, being that the government has said that its forces will not enter Tigray. The Ethiopian forces being very careful, the government being very careful that it does not want to fall victim to accusations of violence once again, which is what they're concerned about, especially because there are fresh moves in the UN to conduct human rights investigations. Again, important to note that there was another round of investigations conducted previously, which exonerated the Ethiopian government. So they're a bit worried about that. But I think for viewers across the world, it's important to note this battle, this fight that's been going on, because it's a key area of US imperialism. As experts such as Dr. Elias Amare have pointed out, the fact that over the past few years, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia were coming closer together and adopting a new plan forward was a huge problem as far as the United States was concerned. They wanted to destabilize the region, and thus when the TPLF rebellion was probably one of the aspects of that. So yet again, like we said, talked about in Yemen, like we talked about in Afghanistan, another instance of what seems to be US strategies in terms of destabilizing the region. Fairly close to Ethiopia, of course, is Libya as well, where elections have been postponed, again going back to 2011, where the NATO-led intervention basically destroyed a country which was quite stable, and its impact continues to this day. So one can definitely hope that there is the possibilities of peace rising once again in Ethiopia, and the project, which seems to be a very important project and a very important strategic region of countries of that locality, of that region coming together and setting their own course, as opposed to being dictated by US and other interests, is actually what the people of that region would want, what is most beneficial for the people of that region. So this, of course, a key moment. We'll have to see in the coming days and weeks how this process unfolds. Still a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. But for the moment, it looks like this is a very important milestone.